Ever wondered how Roman peasants didn't just melt away during those scorching Mediterranean summers? Well, they were surprisingly resourceful about it. And no, they didn't have air conditioning or electric fans tucked away in their modest homes. Their solutions to beating the heat were far more ingenious than you might imagine. I used to think Roman peasant houses were just simple stone boxes hastily put together. But archaeological research reveals they were actually brilliant heat management systems disguised as humble dwellings. Unlike their wealthy urban counterparts who could afford elaborate hypocaust heating systems and marble-lined pools, rural Romans had to get creative with passive cooling techniques that would make modern sustainable architects nod in appreciation. The walls of these modest homes tell the first part of the cooling story. Archaeological excavations across rural Italian settlements show that peasant houses typically featured walls between 1 and 2 feet thick, constructed of sun-dried clay bricks or locally quarried stone. These weren't just sturdy, they were natural insulators. Recent thermal studies of preserved Roman housing structures in places like Pompeii's agricultural outskirts demonstrate these thick walls could maintain interior temperatures 8-10 degrees Celsius below the blistering outside heat, acting as natural thermal barriers. Windows were another clever design element, though not in the way you might expect. Rather than the large openings we prefer today, Roman peasant homes featured strategically small windows positioned high on the walls. This counterintuitive approach actually maximized airflow while minimizing direct sunlight and heat transfer. Archaeological evidence from rural Roman settlements in North Africa shows these high windows created predictable convection currents, drawing hot air up and out while allowing cooler breezes to circulate. Perhaps most ingenious was the incorporation of central courtyards, or atria, even in modest rural dwellings. These weren't just for aesthetics or social gatherings. They functioned as the heart of a natural ventilation system. Studies of preserved floor plans reveal these courtyards created negative pressure zones that continuously pulled air through the structure, providing a primitive form of air conditioning. When paired with carefully positioned doorways, these courtyards generated cross breezes that kept indoor temperatures remarkably comfortable. Have you ever noticed how basements stay cooler in summer? Roman peasants certainly did. Many rural homes featured floors set slightly below ground level, sometimes just a foot or two, but enough to take advantage of the Earth's natural cooling properties. Excavations of farming settlements near Herculaneum revealed that these sunken floors could maintain temperatures up to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than at ground level, providing essential relief during heat waves. But the genius of Roman peasant housing wasn't just in the walls and windows. The materials they chose played an equally critical role in keeping the scorching heat at bay. The materials that made up these rural Roman dwellings were far from randomly chosen. They represented generations of accumulated knowledge about heat management. Unlike today, where we might truck in building supplies from hundreds of miles away, Roman peasants relied exclusively on local materials, but selected them specifically for their natural insulating properties. This wasn't just environmentally friendly, it was thermally brilliant. Those distinctive terracotta roof tiles that defined Roman architecture weren't just aesthetically pleasing, they were functional heat shields. Their reddish-orange colour might seem like it would absorb heat, but archaeological studies have revealed a surprising truth. The specific clay composition and firing techniques used created surfaces that actually reflected a significant portion of the sun's infrared radiation. Experiments conducted on preserved rural Roman roof tiles showed they reflected up to 30% more solar heat than modern concrete tiles. Even more impressive, these tiles released accumulated heat quickly after sunset, helping homes cool rapidly during evening hours. Perhaps the simplest yet most effective cooling technique was the ubiquitous whitewashing of exterior walls. This wasn't just for appearance. Chemical analysis of preserved rural Roman buildings shows these calcium-based white coatings reflected up to 80% of solar radiation. Scientific studies comparing whitewashed and non-whitewashed structures of identical construction found that the white surfaces reduced interior temperatures by up to 5 degrees Celsius during peak heat. Think of how much you'd appreciate a 5 degrees drop during a sweltering August afternoon. Inside those walls, Roman peasants incorporated natural insulating materials with remarkable effectiveness. Archaeological excavations have uncovered wall sections containing carefully layered straw, animal hair, and even wool scraps mixed directly into clay building materials. These organic additions created tiny air pockets that significantly improved the wall's insulating capacity. The famous Roman agricultural writer Columella, in his text De Re Rustica, describes specific ratios of clay, straw, and animal hair that modern scientists have tested and found remarkably effective for temperature regulation, nearly as effective as some modern insulating materials. The roof design itself incorporated sophisticated passive cooling principles. Rural Roman homes typically featured carefully calculated overhangs that blocked the high summer sun, while allowing the lower winter sun to enter and warm the home. This simple yet effective seasonal adaptation demonstrates how thoroughly Romans understood solar patterns and their practical applications in everyday architecture. While their homes provided crucial protection from the blazing sun, Roman peasants understood that surviving the heat required careful planning of their daily schedules, turning the rhythm of their lives into a choreographed dance with the sun. The rhythm of a Roman peasant's day followed the sun with almost religious precision, creating a daily schedule that modern sleep researchers would actually consider remarkably healthy. While we might complain about getting up at 7 a.m. for work, Roman agricultural labourers were already several hours into their workday by then. Agricultural records from the 1st century reveal that summer work typically began around 3-4 a.m. long before sunrise, when temperatures were at their coolest. This wasn't just an arbitrary choice. Analysis of farm productivity records shows that workers completed nearly 60% of their physical labour before the sun had fully risen. What might surprise you is how seriously Romans took their midday rest period, known as meridatio. This wasn't the optional coffee break we might sneak today. It was a mandatory cessation of all non-essential activity during the most dangerous heat hours, typically from noon until about 3 p.m. Archaeological evidence from rural villa sites includes dedicated shaded resting areas specifically designed for these midday breaks. Even more interesting, records from several agricultural estates indicate actual penalties for landowners who forced labourers to work during these forbidden hours. One particularly detailed record from a farm near Campania shows a fine of 5 denarii per worker imposed on an overseer who ordered grain harvesting during peak heat hours. After their afternoon rest, workers would resume activities in the cooler late afternoon, continuing until dusk. This created a split workday with a substantial break in the middle, a pattern that modern physiologists have confirmed aligns perfectly with human core temperature regulation patterns, optimizing both productivity and health. Perhaps most impressive was their system for categorizing tasks by heat sensitivity. Archaeological records from several rural estates show detailed task schedules, with activities like harvesting leafy vegetables assigned exclusively to pre-dawn hours, while less heat-sensitive work like tool repair was reserved for late afternoon. Romans didn't need fancy weather apps to track dangerous heat periods. They used a remarkably accurate system of shadow measurements. Excavations have uncovered stone markers that, when paired with the sun's position, created specific shadow patterns, indicating when work should cease or resume. These shadow clocks were so precise that researchers have found they reliably indicated temperature thresholds within about 2 degrees. The Roman agricultural writer Columella describe this scheduling in remarkable detail, noting that the wise farmer completes the delicate work before the 4th hour, when Phoebus begins his harshest assault upon the land. Modern analysis of these ancient schedules shows they typically kept core body temperatures within optimal ranges, despite the extreme environmental heat, a testament to centuries of observational wisdom. This careful scheduling extended beyond just their working hours. Their eating habits were strategically designed to help them cope with the oppressive heat. The Roman peasant's summer diet was essentially nature's air conditioning in edible form. Unlike our modern habit of eating the same foods year-round, Romans dramatically altered their diets as temperatures climbed. Analysis of preserved food remains from rural Roman sites reveals summer diets contained approximately 70% more water-rich foods than their winter counterparts. This wasn't just preference, it was survival strategy. During the hottest months, meals centered around hydrating fruits and vegetables that we might recognize today. Cucumbers, melons, grapes, and various leafy greens dominated their plates. What's particularly interesting is how archaeological evidence from rural Roman middens, trash deposits, shows distinct seasonal layering of food waste. Nutshells and grain husks dominate winter layers, while summer layers contain significantly more fruit seeds and vegetable remains. This scientific evidence confirms what Roman agricultural writers like Pliny described about seasonal dietary shifts. The timing of meals was just as strategic as their content. Romans consumed their heaviest meal at dawn, before the grueling farm work began, allowing digestion to complete before the day's worst heat arrived. Midday meals during Meridatio were intentionally light and cooling, often consisting of bread dipped in watered wine or vinegar, accompanied by raw vegetables or fruit. Archaeological evidence of dining spaces shows distinct summer eating areas, oriented to capture breezes, often located near water features for additional cooling effects. Perhaps the most ingenious dietary adaptation was the widespread consumption of posca, a mixture of vinegar, water, and herbs that served as the Gatorade of ancient Rome. This wasn't just a refreshing drink, it was functional hydration. The vinegar helped preserve the water from bacterial growth while providing essential electrolytes that prevented heat exhaustion. Modern nutritional analysis has confirmed that posca's composition makes it remarkably effective for preventing dehydration in extreme heat. Archaeological digs have uncovered specialized summer food storage vessels designed specifically to keep contents cool through evaporative principles. These porous clay containers, often with unique double-wall construction, kept perishable foods fresh much longer than conventional storage. The effectiveness of these designs has impressed modern researchers. Tests show they can maintain interior temperatures up to 15 degrees cooler than ambient conditions. Roman writings frequently mention the deliberate addition of cooling herbs to summer meals. Mint, coriander, and melissa, lemon balm, were specifically noted for their cooling properties. Modern scientific research has actually confirmed these herbs contain natural compounds that trigger the body's cooling responses. Roman peasants were essentially practicing phytomedicine without realizing it. One recovered recipe calls for a cooling mixture of crushed mint with cucumber and whey that modern nutritionists recognize as a nearly perfect hot weather recovery food. Of course, staying properly hydrated was even more important than food for surviving the relentless summer heat. And Roman peasants developed remarkably sophisticated water management systems. Water wasn't just important to Roman peasants, it was sacred, precious, and meticulously managed through systems that would impress modern engineers. While wealthy urban Romans enjoyed elaborate aqueducts, rural communities developed equally effective, though less monumental, water management systems. At the heart of these systems were community cisterns that collected and stored valuable winter rainwater for use during the scorching summer months. Archaeological excavations across rural Italy and Spain have uncovered remarkable evidence of these structures, some capable of storing up to 50,000 litres of water, enough to sustain a small farming community through months of drought. These weren't simply holes in the ground. Excavated cisterns reveal sophisticated engineering, waterproof linings made of multiple layers of opus sininum, a waterproof cement, settling basins to remove impurities, and even basic filtration systems using sand and charcoal. One particularly well-preserved cistern, discovered near Pompeii's agricultural outskirts, features a multi-chamber design that researchers believe helped maintain water quality through thermal stratification. Cooler, fresher water remained accessible even as drought continued. Perhaps most impressive was how these communities managed their water resources. Archaeological evidence from several rural Roman settlements reveals rotation systems for water usage during drought periods. Inscribed clay tablets from a farming community near Taraco, modern Tarragona, detail a remarkably fair water allocation system based on household size, livestock numbers, and crop types. During severe droughts, these allocations were adjusted weekly based on remaining supplies. One recovered tablet outlines penalties for those who exceeded their allotment, typically additional labour service to the community. The way Romans stored drinking water was particularly ingenious. They used porous terracotta vessels designed specifically to cool water through evaporation, essentially the same principle as modern evaporative coolers. These vessels were often buried partially in the ground for maximum cooling effect. Studies recreating these ancient cooling methods have shown that water stored this way could maintain temperatures 10 to 15 degrees below ambient conditions, turning potentially dangerous warm water into refreshing, safe hydration even during the hottest days. Roman peasants also demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of natural springs and groundwater. Agricultural texts describe detailed methods for locating underground water sources by observing surface vegetation patterns. Archaeological surveys have confirmed the accuracy of these methods, showing that rural Roman wells were positioned with remarkable precision over optimal groundwater access points. Some communities developed specialised roles for individuals with particular skill in water finding, a position that carried significant social status. What's particularly interesting is how these water management systems became increasingly sophisticated over time. Early cisterns from the Republican period, 3rd to 1st century BCE, show basic designs, while later imperial-era systems, 1st to 3rd century CE, incorporate multiple innovations for preservation and purification. This suggests continuous improvement through careful observation and community knowledge sharing, all without the scientific instruments we rely on today. With their bodies properly hydrated, Roman peasants turned their attention to perhaps the most immediate way to beat the heat, their clever choices in summer clothing. Roman summer fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was sophisticated heat management technology disguised as simple clothing. Unlike the heavy wool garments favoured during winter months, summer saw rural Romans switching entirely to loose-fitting tunics made of lightweight linen. These weren't just thinner versions of winter clothes. They represented a complete seasonal wardrobe change, designed specifically for heat management. Archaeological textile remains from rural Roman sites tell a fascinating story about these summer garments. Modern analysis shows summer fabrics were woven with 30–40% lower thread density than their winter counterparts, creating more breathable material that allowed air circulation directly against the skin. What's particularly impressive is how consistent this pattern is across different regions and time periods, suggesting this wasn't random but deliberate engineering. Colour choice was equally strategic. While we often imagine Romans in colourful togas, rural workers typically wore undyed or intentionally bleached white garments during summer. This wasn't just aesthetic preference, it was practical physics. Scientific testing of preserved fabric fragments confirms that the natural linen or bleached fabrics reflected up to 50% more sunlight than dyed alternatives. When your work requires hours in direct Mediterranean sun, that reflection made a significant difference in body temperature. Head protection came in the form of the patasus, a wide-brimmed straw hat that provided crucial shade to the face and neck. Unlike modern hats, these weren't just simple circles. Archaeological findings show they were carefully engineered with specific brim widths that maximised shade throughout the day as the sun's angle changed. Some recovered examples even show adjustable fitting systems that allowed the wearer to secure the hat in different positions depending on wind conditions and sun angle. Footwear received equally careful consideration. Records describe specialised summer sandals with open designs that allowed feet to breathe and sweat to evaporate. Archaeological specimens show these weren't just simplified versions of regular shoes. They featured strategic ventilation holes and were made from materials selected specifically for their cooling properties. One particularly well-preserved example from a rural site near Herculaneum shows a sophisticated design with elevated footbed that reduced contact with hot ground surfaces. Perhaps the most ingenious clothing adaptation was the practice of dampening outer tunics in the morning. Historical records indicate workers would lightly wet their outer garments, creating a natural cooling system as the water evaporated throughout the morning hours. Modern testing shows this technique can reduce perceived temperature by up to 5 degrees Celsius for several hours, a significant advantage when working in temperatures regularly exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. Even more surprising is evidence that linen garments were sometimes soaked in specific herb mixtures before wearing. Analysis of textile fragments has identified traces of herbs like mint and melissa, which weren't just for pleasant scent. These plants contain compounds that create a cooling sensation on the skin and provide natural UV protection. Modern dermatological testing has confirmed these herbal compounds can reduce UV exposure by up to 25%, an early form of sunscreen built directly into clothing. While clothing provided immediate relief from the sun's rays, Roman peasants also transformed their immediate surroundings into cooler micro-environments through clever landscaping. The landscaping around Roman rural homes wasn't random beautification. It was calculated environmental engineering designed to create personal cooling zones in the harsh Mediterranean summer. Archaeological surveys have revealed that Roman peasant dwellings typically featured carefully positioned shade trees, particularly on southern and western exposures where sun exposure was most intense. These weren't just any trees. They specifically favoured species like cypress and oak that provided maximum shade with minimal water requirements. One excavated homestead near Lucania showed evidence of an almost perfect semicircle of tree planting positions on the southern exposure, creating what environmental scientists now recognise as an optimal shade pattern throughout the entire day. Perhaps the most ingenious landscaping technique was the training of grapevines over pergola structures to create living shade roofs over outdoor work and leisure areas. Pollen analysis from several rural Roman sites has revealed a fascinating pattern. Grape pollen appears consistently in areas adjacent to dwellings, even in regions not known for wine production. This suggests vines were being cultivated primarily for their shade value rather than fruit production. The genius of this approach was multifunctional design. The leaf canopy provided dense shade in summer when foliage was full, while naturally allowing warming sunlight during winter after leaves fell. Roman agricultural writers like Columella and Varro were surprisingly specific about optimal home positioning relative to prevailing winds. One often quoted passage describes the ideal home site as where austere, south wind, cannot scorch and Favonius, west wind, may enter freely. Archaeological evidence confirms they followed this advice. Rural Roman homes show consistent orientation patterns that maximised exposure to cooling breezes while minimising hot wind exposure. Modern climate studies have confirmed these historical wind patterns remain largely unchanged today, validating the Romans' observational accuracy. Water features served as natural air conditioners in the Roman landscape. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of small water channels, strategically positioned to capture and direct breezes across water surfaces before entering homes. This wasn't just pleasant aesthetically, it was practical thermodynamics. As air passed over water, evaporative cooling reduced air temperature before it entered living spaces. One particularly sophisticated example, found near Capua, featured a circular pattern of shallow water channels around a central courtyard, ensuring that breezes from any direction would cross water before reaching inhabitants. What's particularly impressive is the scientific accuracy of these intuitive approaches. Plant pollen analysis from several rural sites shows a distinct pattern of species selection, favouring those with high transpiration rates, plants that release significant moisture through their leaves, naturally cooling surrounding air. Modern environmental studies recreating these landscaping techniques have shown they can reduce ambient temperatures by 3 to 7 degrees Celsius, approximately the same cooling power as a modern residential air conditioning unit. The intentionality behind these designs is further confirmed by the recovery of planting guidelines in agricultural texts. Specific spacing recommendations for trees based on sun angles, appropriate vine training techniques for maximum summer shade, and even seasonal pruning instructions all point to sophisticated understanding of how vegetation affects microclimate. One recovered text includes detailed instructions for calculating optimal pergola height based on latitude, a remarkably scientific approach for people without modern measuring tools. Beyond their individual homes, entire Roman peasant communities were designed with heat management in mind, creating cooperative systems that benefited everyone during the hottest months. Roman villages weren't randomly placed on the landscape. Their locations were strategically selected with heat management as a primary consideration. Archaeological surveys across formerly Roman territories reveal a consistent pattern. Rural settlements were frequently positioned near water sources or on north-facing slopes that received less direct sunlight during summer months. One particularly telling study of 30 rural Roman settlements in central Italy found that 24 were positioned on slight north-facing inclines, a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. These locations typically received up to 40% less afternoon sun exposure during summer months while still capturing beneficial morning sunlight. The centre of village life wasn't just a social hub, it was an engineered cooling zone. Archaeological evidence shows many rural communities erected large communal shade structures in central gathering areas. These weren't just simple canopies, they were sophisticated designs using overlapping layers of materials that created cooling air circulation patterns. Excavations at several sites have uncovered post-hole patterns indicating structures specifically angled to maximise shade during the hottest afternoon hours, while allowing morning sun to warm the space during cooler hours. Would you have thought that Romans were calculating sun angles and shadow patterns without modern tools? Perhaps most impressive was how communities coordinated labour to minimise heat exposure. Village records indicate rotation systems for the most physically demanding summer tasks, ensuring no single family bore the full burden of heat-intensive work. One recovered inscription from a farming settlement in Hispania details a remarkable system where threshing duties, among the most strenuous summer tasks, rotated daily between households, with specific adjustments for elderly or ill community members. This wasn't just kindness, it was practical community survival strategy. Even the very layout of Roman villages reflected sophisticated understanding of natural ventilation principles. Archaeological evidence reveals many rural settlements were designed with street patterns that created what modern architects would call wind corridors. pathways that channeled and accelerated prevailing breezes through common areas. Modern wind pattern analysis of preserved Roman village layouts confirms these designs effectively increased air movement by up to 30% compared to random street arrangements. One particularly well-preserved village site near Syracuse shows a remarkable radial street pattern that channeled sea breezes directly to the central plaza. Community wells served as both practical water sources and cooling centres. Archaeological evidence consistently shows these vital water sources were centrally located under large communal shade structures. The combination of water evaporation and shade created naturally air-conditioned gathering spaces where community members could find relief during the hottest hours. Temperature measurements taken at reconstructed sites show these areas could maintain temperatures 5 to 7 degrees below surrounding areas, making them natural cooling stations during dangerous heat waves. The positioning of buildings within villages also reflected heat management priorities. Archaeological surveys show that structures were often arranged to cast shadows on each other during peak heat hours, while maintaining open southern exposures during winter months when sunlight was beneficial. This suggests a community-wide approach to seasonal sun management that maximised collective comfort without requiring extensive individual modifications. These communal efforts were important, but when temperatures became truly unbearable, Roman peasants had specific places they could retreat to for immediate relief from the scorching heat. For those days when even the best community planning couldn't overcome extreme heat, Roman peasants relied on nature's original air conditioning, the cooling power of the earth itself. Archaeological excavations across rural Roman territories have uncovered evidence of semi-subterranean rooms specifically designed for heat relief. These weren't damp, unpleasant cellars, but carefully engineered spaces that maintained temperatures 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below surface readings. One particularly well-preserved example, discovered near Tarakina, featured whitewashed walls to maximize light reflection, ventilation shafts positioned to capture prevailing breezes, and even stone benches built into the walls, clearly a space designed for extended occupation during heat waves. Natural geological features became community assets during summer months. Caves and grottos near villages were maintained as shared cooling centres, with archaeological evidence showing pathways cleared and maintained specifically to these natural retreats. Pollen analysis from several cave sites near Roman settlements reveals increased plant diversity near entrances, suggesting deliberate cultivation of shade plants to enhance the cooling effect around these natural retreats. One community record from southern Italy mentions the appointment of custodes speluncarum, cave guardians, responsible for maintaining these natural cooling centres, evidence of their importance to community survival. Underground storage areas serve dual purposes in Roman rural life. While primarily designed for food preservation, archaeological evidence shows many were intentionally enlarged and enhanced to accommodate human occupation during extreme heat. Excavations at several rural villas have uncovered storage cellars with bench-like structures, oil lamp niches, and even decorative elements that would be unnecessary in spaces used solely for storage. Temperature monitoring at these sites shows they consistently maintain temperatures 8 to 12 degrees below ambient conditions, even during the hottest summer days. An invaluable refuge when surface temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Some communities invested in dedicated cooling houses, specialised structures optimised for heat relief. Archaeological evidence from several rural sites shows buildings with unusual features, exceptionally thick walls, sometimes exceeding 3 feet, limited window openings on southern exposures, and integrated water features that enhanced evaporative cooling. One remarkable example, uncovered near modern Naples, includes a central water basin with surrounding stone benches, a design that modern environmental engineers confirm would have created natural evaporative cooling while allowing multiple people to benefit from the effect. What's particularly fascinating is how access to these cooling spaces was managed. Community records show rotation schedules for access to cooling retreats during extreme heat waves, ensuring all families received fair opportunity for relief. More remarkable still is evidence that these systems prioritise the most vulnerable. Elderly residents and young children consistently received preferential scheduling. One recovered inscription details a rotation system where those of tender or advanced years shall have access during the 4th through 6th hours, exactly when daily temperatures peaked. The maintenance of community cooling spaces wasn't left to chance. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates some villages designated specific families to maintain these crucial resources, with tax breaks or other compensation provided in exchange. This institutionalization of cooling space maintenance underscores how seriously Romans took heat management. It wasn't just personal comfort at stake, but community survival. While these physical spaces provided crucial relief, Roman peasants also developed specialized techniques for cooling their bodies directly when the heat became overwhelming. When other cooling methods weren't enough, Roman peasants essentially turned their own bodies into cooling systems through remarkably sophisticated personal techniques. Medical texts from the period reveal detailed instructions for applying dampened cloths to specific pulse points, wrists, neck, temples and behind the knees, to rapidly lower body temperature. These weren't just random spots. They targeted major blood vessels close to the skin surface, where cooling would most effectively reduce core temperature. The Roman physician Galen specifically described this technique as cooling the rivers of the body. Demonstrating an intuitive understanding of circulation, centuries before blood flow was scientifically understood. Modern medical research confirms these specific locations can effectively lower core body temperature by 1 to 2 degrees when properly cooled, enough to make a critical difference during dangerous heat waves. Roman peasants practiced specific breathing techniques designed to reduce body heat. Archaeological evidence of this comes from unusual pottery whistles found at rural sites that generated distinct tones when exhaled through. Experimental reconstructions suggest these devices guided users to perform slow, controlled exhalations that modern respiratory physiologists recognize as promoting evaporative cooling in the respiratory tract. Literary references describe these techniques as breathing like the sleeping ox, slow, deep breaths with extended exhalations that modern studies confirm can reduce perceived temperature and prevent heat-related hyperventilation. Perhaps most sophisticated were the cooling oils and herbal mixtures developed for skin application. Analysis of preserved cosmetic containers from rural Roman sites has revealed remarkable cooling compounds made with mint, cucumber, aloe, and other botanicals. Chemical analysis shows these formulations contain natural menthol compounds that trigger cold-sensing nerves in the skin, creating immediate cooling sensations. One particularly well-preserved sample from a farm site near Herculaneum contained a compound remarkably similar to modern cooling gels, with ingredients that would effectively reduce skin temperature through both evaporation and neurological pathways. For personal microclimate control, Roman peasants employed small wet clay pots as portable cooling devices. These weren't elaborate mechanisms, simply unglazed pottery filled with water that cooled through evaporation. Archaeological evidence shows these portable coolers often featured specialized designs with ridged exterior surfaces that maximized evaporative surface area. Records indicate these simple devices were commonly used during sleep, positioned near the head or feet to create cooling air currents. Modern recreations have demonstrated these devices can reduce surrounding air temperature by 3 to 5 degrees within a small radius, perfect for targeted cooling of sleeping areas. Roman agricultural texts describe ingenious techniques for cooling sleeping mats using dampened reeds. By soaking specific types of hollow reeds in water before weaving them into sleeping mats, they created naturally cooling surfaces that released moisture slowly throughout the night. Scientific analysis of preserved reed fragments shows certain species were specifically selected for this purpose, containing natural structures that regulated water release rates, essentially creating primitive slow-release cooling systems. What's particularly impressive is how integrated these approaches were. Medical texts from the period don't just list cooling techniques in isolation, but describe comprehensive systems combining multiple methods based on specific heat conditions and individual needs. One such text advises applying cooling oils before sleep, positioning evaporative cooling pots near the bed, and using specific breathing techniques upon waking. A remarkably holistic approach to personal temperature regulation. These personal cooling methods were essential, but perhaps the most impressive aspect of Roman heat management was their sophisticated understanding of when various approaches should be used, based on careful environmental monitoring. Long before modern weather forecasting, Roman peasants developed remarkably sophisticated systems to track and predict dangerous heat periods. Without thermometers or satellite imagery, they relied on careful observation of natural indicators and community-based monitoring systems that modern meteorologists have found surprisingly accurate. Agricultural texts from the period describe elaborate prediction methods based on patterns of previous years, seasonal wind shifts, and cloud formations. One particularly detailed account from Columella's agricultural writings describes how to forecast summer heat intensity by observing spring wind patterns, a correlation modern climate scientists have confirmed has about 65% predictive accuracy. The natural world served as their primary forecasting tool. Roman farmers closely monitored specific plant behaviours that signalled approaching heat waves. Agricultural texts describe in precise detail how certain plants, particularly varieties of morning glory and specific types of clover, would alter their leaf positions days before extreme heat arrived. Modern botanical studies have confirmed these plants indeed respond to barometric and humidity changes that precede heat events. One text specifically instructs farmers to watch when the shepherd's purse folds its leaves upward and the oxalis closes before midday. Signs that indicate dangerous heat within 48 to 72 hours with remarkable reliability. Animal patterns provided another prediction layer. Romans observed that certain behaviours, bees clustering at hive entrances, lizards retreating deeper into stone walls, or birds bathing more frequently, consistently preceded extreme heat events. Community records from several rural settlements mention designated heat watchers, who specifically monitored these animal indicators and alerted the community to approaching dangerous conditions. Modern wildlife biologists have confirmed many animals do indeed detect environmental changes 2 or 3 days before weather shifts, making this approach scientifically sound despite its pre-technological origins. Perhaps most ingenious were the physical measurement systems Romans developed to quantify temperature intensity. Archaeological evidence shows they placed clay vessels of varying thickness in standardized positions around villages and farms. The pattern of which vessels cracked under heat stress provided a crude but effective temperature scale. Experiments recreating these systems have shown they could differentiate temperature ranges with surprising accuracy. Thin-walled vessels would crack at approximately 35 degrees, while medium-thickness vessels would only crack when temperatures exceeded 40 degrees. This provided communities with a simple, visual indicator of dangerous heat thresholds. Community record-keeping enhanced the accuracy of these predictions. Archaeological evidence from several rural Roman sites includes clay tablets with systematic weather observations spanning decades. These records tracked seasonal patterns, documented prediction successes and failures, and refined forecasting methods over generations. This accumulated knowledge allowed communities to prepare for heat waves with remarkable foresight. One recovered tablet series from southern Italy shows annotations correlating spring conditions with subsequent summer heat intensity over a 15-year period. Essentially, a primitive statistical model. What's particularly impressive is the community integration of these monitoring systems. Villages didn't rely on individual observations, but appointed specific people responsible for different prediction methods. Evidence suggests some communities had 3 distinct roles: plant watchers, animal observers, and physical indicator monitors, who combined their observations to make community-wide predictions. Modern meteorologists analysing these integrated systems have found they achieved approximately 70% accuracy for forecasting severe heat waves, remarkably effective for pre-technological methods. All this careful monitoring helped Roman peasants prepare for the inevitable heat-related illnesses that sometimes struck, despite their best preventive efforts. Despite all their preventative measures, Romans knew that heat-related illnesses would occasionally strike, particularly among those working the fields during harvest seasons. What's remarkable is how accurately they identified and treated these conditions without modern medical knowledge. Medical texts from the period describe heat exhaustion symptoms with precision that still impresses modern physicians. The Roman physician Celsus detailed the summer fever with skin hot but dry, confusion of thoughts, great thirst, and weakness of limbs. A textbook description of heat exhaustion that wouldn't be out of place in modern medical literature. These texts even differentiated between milder heat stress and the more dangerous heat stroke, describing the critical warning sign of cessation of sweating with continued heat, exactly what modern medicine recognizes as the dangerous transition to heat stroke. Roman peasants developed remarkably effective herbal remedies for heat-related conditions. Analysis of preserved medicinal containers from rural Roman sites has revealed compounds containing specific herbs and minerals that modern pharmacology confirms would effectively address heat illness. One particularly sophisticated mixture found in a farmer's home near Pompeii contained mint, elderflower, and salt crystals, ingredients that would provide cooling effects, promote sweating, and replace essential electrolytes. Another common preparation combined willow bark, containing salicin similar to modern aspirin, with cucumber extract and whey, a formula that would reduce fever, cool the skin, and restore electrolyte balance. Communities established specific cooling protocols for treating suspected heat stroke victims. Archaeological evidence from several rural settlements reveals designated cooling areas featuring stone slabs that would remain naturally cool. Records indicate these areas were maintained specifically for emergency cooling treatments. One remarkably detailed account describes a treatment sequence of first placing the afflicted on cooling stones, then applying dampened cloths to the neck and chest, followed by small sips of salted wine once confusion abates. A protocol surprisingly similar to modern emergency heat stroke management. Perhaps most impressive was their focus on prevention. Community records indicate that during predicted heat waves, preventative medicines were distributed, particularly to those working in exposed conditions. Archaeological evidence includes specialized ceramic containers designed for carrying preventative tonics into the fields, many bearing inscriptions urging regular consumption before thirst becomes severe. Analysis of residue from these containers shows electrolyte-rich compounds containing minerals and herbs that would help maintain proper hydration and body temperature regulation. Modern medical analysis confirms many of these preventatives would have been genuinely effective at reducing heat illness risk. The community approach to heat illness was remarkably organised. Records indicate certain individuals received specific training in recognising and treating heat-related conditions. These designated heat healers held important community positions and were exempt from certain field labour, so they could remain available to monitor workers and provide immediate treatment when needed. Archaeological evidence from several rural villas includes specialised treatment rooms with northern exposures and water features specifically designed for cooling heat-affected individuals, early versions of medical cooling centres. What's particularly noteworthy is how Romans integrated preventative measures with treatment protocols. During highest risk periods, field workers rotated through cooling breaks at scheduled intervals, consumed preventative tonics on a strict schedule, and were continuously monitored by designated observers watching for early symptoms. This systematic approach to heat illness prevention and management rivals modern workplace heat safety protocols, all without contemporary medical knowledge or technology. While adults faced serious challenges in the heat, Roman peasants showed particular ingenuity in protecting their most vulnerable community members, their children and elderly. The most impressive aspect of Roman heat management wasn't how they protected their strongest members, but rather the sophisticated systems developed to shield their most vulnerable populations. Archaeological evidence from rural Roman sites consistently reveals specialised cooling areas specifically designated for elderly community members and children. These weren't simple shaded areas, but carefully engineered spaces that maximised cooling effects. Excavations at several rural settlements have uncovered structures with distinctive features: thicker than average walls, specialised ventilation systems, and often partial subterranean construction, all positioned within easy walking distance of community gathering areas. One particularly well-preserved example, near Capua, features a semi-underground chamber, specifically positioned to capture prevailing breezes, with stone benches sized appropriately for both elderly adults and children. Village records show remarkable organisational sophistication in protecting vulnerable members. Communities appointed designated heat guardians, estus custodes in some texts, specifically responsible for monitoring elderly, ill or very young community members during dangerous heat periods. These weren't informal arrangements. Recovered tablets from rural communities detail specific rotation schedules, visitation routes, and even standardised assessment protocols to evaluate heat stress. One particularly detailed record from a farming settlement describes a system where each vulnerable individual received 3 daily visits during heat waves, with specific cooling interventions prescribed based on observed conditions. Nutrition played a crucial role in heat protection strategies. Medical texts describe specialised diets designed specifically for those most susceptible to heat illness. These weren't simply lighter versions of regular meals, but carefully formulated nutritional programs that modern analysis confirms would enhance heat tolerance. Archaeological evidence includes specialised feeding vessels for both elderly and infants that were designed to keep contents cool longer. Analysis of residue from these containers reveals high electrolyte liquid foods that would effectively maintain hydration and mineral balance, essentially ancient versions of modern rehydration solutions. Children's activities were structured with remarkable attention to temperature patterns. Community schedules show that children's education and work activities were carefully timed to avoid heat exposure, with outdoor activities restricted to early morning hours and specific indoor learning activities scheduled during peak heat. Archaeological evidence from rural school areas shows specialised summer learning spaces with cooling features not present in winter classroom areas. Even children's games were seasonally adjusted. Recovered toys and game pieces show different types, predominating in summer deposits versus winter areas, suggesting activity intensity was deliberately modulated based on season. The community took these protection systems extremely seriously. Records indicate actual penalties for those who neglected their responsibilities in checking on vulnerable members during heat waves. One village tablet describes a fine of 2 jugs of oil and 1 day of community labour imposed on an individual who failed to complete assigned check-ins during a heat emergency. The text specifically notes this was a reduced penalty because no harm resulted, suggesting more severe consequences if neglect led to actual heat illness. What's particularly touching about these systems is how they reveal Roman community values. Despite the constant struggle for agricultural survival, significant community resources were devoted to protecting those who were not actively contributing to food production. These weren't just compassionate gestures, but institutionalized systems reflecting a deep understanding that community survival depended on protecting all members, regardless of productive capacity. With all these remarkable heat management strategies, Roman peasants still faced the challenge of protecting their critical food supply during the hottest months, requiring equally ingenious preservation techniques. Keeping food from spoiling during intense Mediterranean summers presented Roman peasants with perhaps their greatest survival challenge. Without refrigeration, a single heat wave could destroy months of carefully grown food supplies. Their solution? Transform the earth itself into a natural refrigerator. Archaeological excavations across rural Roman territories have uncovered sophisticated underground food storage chambers specifically designed to preserve summer harvests. These weren't simple root cellars, but carefully engineered structures that consistently maintained temperatures 8 to 12 degrees Celsius below ambient conditions. One particularly impressive example, discovered near modern Naples, features multiple chambers at varying depths, each maintaining different temperature ranges suitable for specific food types. Essentially, a multi-temperature refrigeration system using only natural cooling principles. For foods that required more immediate preservation, Romans developed remarkably effective evaporative cooling techniques. Analysis of preserved food vessels shows specialized designs that maximize cooling through controlled evaporation. These double-walled containers, often with porous outer layers kept dampened with water, created localized cooling zones that could preserve dairy products and certain vegetables for several additional days during intense heat. Experimental reconstructions of these vessels have demonstrated they can maintain interior temperatures up to 15 degrees Celsius below ambient conditions, sufficient to prevent rapid spoilage of many perishable foods. One particularly ingenious design recovered from a rural villa featured a series of stacked cooling containers with water trickling from top to bottom, creating a continuous evaporative cooling effect for multiple food items simultaneously. The Romans developed specialized preservation methods specifically optimized for summer conditions. While smoking, brining and fermenting were common across many ancient cultures, Roman agricultural texts describe specific modifications to these techniques for high heat periods. Archaeological evidence includes specialized summer smoking chambers designed to operate at lower temperatures than winter equivalents, preventing the rapid food deterioration that excessive heat would cause. Analysis of residue from brining vessels shows seasonal adjustments to salt concentrations and preservative herbs based on ambient temperature. Studies of preserved food remains indicate Romans understood exactly how different preservation methods performed in high heat conditions and adjusted their techniques accordingly. Perhaps most impressive was the community-level organization of food resources during dangerous heat waves. Records describe sophisticated rotation systems ensuring that foods most vulnerable to spoilage were consumed first, while more stable items could be reserved for later use. Archaeological evidence from several rural communities includes designated community food managers who coordinated preservation efforts during heat emergencies. One remarkably detailed record tablet outlines a community-wide system where households contributed specific food items to central preservation efforts based on each family's preservation capabilities, maximizing the community's overall food security through coordinated action. The knowledge required for effective summer food preservation was clearly valued and protected. Archaeological evidence includes instructional tablets with detailed preservation guidelines, suggesting this information was formally documented and passed between generations. Analysis of preserved food vessels from different time periods shows continuous improvement in design, indicating ongoing refinement of preservation techniques over centuries. Food preservation wasn't simply individual households struggling independently, but a sophisticated community knowledge system that evolved through careful observation and experimentation. What's particularly fascinating is how Romans developed integrated preservation systems, matching specific foods with optimal preservation methods based on the food's characteristics and the prevailing weather conditions. This wasn't simple tradition, but sophisticated food science developed through generations of careful observation. Modern food scientists recreating these methods have expressed surprise at their effectiveness, particularly given the absence of contemporary understanding of bacteria and food chemistry. These food preservation techniques ensured survival through the hottest days. But Roman peasants also found ways to transform the summer's bounty into valuable resources that would sustain them throughout the year. Summer's intense heat, the very force that threatened Roman survival, was ingeniously transformed into a powerful resource through techniques that harnessed rather than merely endured the scorching sun. Archaeological evidence across rural Roman settlements reveals specialized drying platforms and racks specifically designed to maximize solar exposure for fruit and herb preservation. These weren't just random flat surfaces, but carefully engineered structures with specific angles and orientations that optimize drying conditions. One particularly sophisticated example, discovered near Syracuse, features adjustable drying planes that could be repositioned throughout the day to follow the sun's path. Essentially, a passive solar tracking system developed 2 millennia before modern solar technology. The summer sun became a critical manufacturing asset, particularly for brick production. Archaeological evidence shows brickmaking was primarily a summer activity, with production sites strategically positioned to maximize exposure during peak heat hours. Analysis of preserved Roman bricks reveals they achieved remarkably consistent firing quality despite using only solar heat for the initial drying phase. A process that required precise understanding of how drying rates affected final product strength. Modern construction experiments have demonstrated that properly sun-dried clay achieves significantly greater structural integrity before firing than artificially dried materials, validating the Roman approach. Coastal communities transformed summer heat into valuable salt production opportunities. Archaeological evidence from several Mediterranean coastal sites shows specialized salt-making installations that operated primarily during the hottest months, when evaporation rates were highest. These weren't simple evaporation pools, but sophisticated graduated systems where seawater moved through progressively smaller pools, increasing salt concentration at each stage. Production records indicate salt-making activities were precisely scheduled around optimal evaporation periods, with communities coordinating labour to maximize production during these critical windows. The Romans strategically scheduled heat-intensive crafts for summer months. Pottery firing, charcoal making, and metallurgical activities, all requiring significant heat input, were specifically concentrated during the hottest period of the year. Archaeological evidence shows seasonal patterns in these activities, with workshop areas showing intense use during summer months, followed by relative inactivity in cooler seasons. This seasonal specialization allowed communities to leverage naturally occurring heat that would otherwise represent wasted energy, essentially using the summer sun as a free fuel source that reduced wood consumption by an estimated 40% for these activities. Summer also offered unique harvesting opportunities for medicinal and practical resources. Certain plants valuable for medicine, dyes, and household goods reached peak potency during the hottest months. Community records indicate coordinated efforts for gathering these summer-specific resources, with designated individuals responsible for identifying optimal harvesting times. Analysis of preserved medicinal materials shows sophisticated knowledge of how solar heat affected both preservation quality and medicinal potency. One particularly detailed record tablet outlines specific harvesting times for different medicinal herbs based on daily temperature patterns, morning collection for some varieties, and afternoon gathering for others, depending on when specific compounds reached optimal concentration. What's most remarkable about these summer resource gathering systems is how they transformed what could have been the year's most challenging period into one of its most productive. Analysis of activity patterns in preserved records indicates summer months actually accounted for approximately 40% of the annual production of preserved goods, despite representing only 25% of the year. This intensification of specific productive activities during summer created a seasonal resource buffer that supported communities throughout the year. Roman peasants didn't just survive the scorching Mediterranean summers, they developed sophisticated systems that allowed them to thrive during them, turning what could have been their most challenging season into one of their most productive. Through generations of careful observation, community coordination, and ingenious adaptation, they transformed a potential threat into an opportunity, creating seasonal rhythms of activity perfectly attuned to their challenging environment.